Let's get started. Story number 1.
I never used to believe in ghosts. I always thought they were just stories, tales passed down, twisted, and exaggerated over time. That was before I had an encounter that changed everything. It happened in the fall of 2019. I had just moved to a small town in upstate New York for a new job. The town was quiet, with old buildings and streets that seemed frozen in time. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names. My apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building, the kind with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and I liked the solitude. I had always been a night owl. Even as a kid, I preferred the quiet of the night over the chaos of the day. It was during one of these late nights that I first saw him. It was a little after midnight. I had been reading, curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, when I decided to get some fresh air. My apartment had a small balcony that overlooked the street below. It wasn't much of a view, just the empty road, a few parked cars, and the flickering streetlights. As I stepped outside, I immediately noticed him, a man standing directly under the streetlight across the road. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with his hands tucked into his coat pockets. At first, I thought nothing of it, just someone out for a late-night walk. But something about him felt off. He wasn't moving. He wasn't looking at a phone or smoking a cigarette. He just stood there, perfectly still, facing my building. I shivered. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a public street. People walked around all the time. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was just lost. I tried to ignore him, but as I turned to go back inside, I felt a strange sensation, a heavy, sinking feeling in my chest like I was being watched. I glanced back. He was still there. Had he moved closer? I couldn't be sure. I went inside, locking the door behind me. It took me a while to fall asleep that night. The next night, I saw him again. Same spot, same posture, same eerie stillness. I felt a strange sense of dread creep up my spine. This time I decided to be rational. Maybe he was just some harmless guy who lived nearby. Maybe he liked standing there. I tried to shake it off, but when I woke up around 3 a.m., my heart nearly stopped. There was a knock on my door, a slow, deliberate knock. I froze. I lived alone. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? I sat up in bed, listening. My apartment was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, another knock. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I got up slowly, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Every instinct in my body told me not to open that door, but I had to look. I crept to the peephole and peered through. No one was there. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard it. A whisper, right on the other side of the door. "You're late." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid. I started seeing the man more often, always at night, always standing under the same streetlight. He never moved, never spoke. But the knocking continued, every night at 3 a.m., always 3 knocks, always followed by the same whisper, "You're late." By the 4th night, I was at my breaking point. I was exhausted, terrified, and desperate for an explanation. I decided I needed to confront him. That night, I waited. At 2:55 a.m., I sat by the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. My hands were clammy, my breath shallow. Then, right on time, 3 knocks. I gripped the doorknob, took a deep breath, and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, but something was wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating. The overhead lights flickered. The hallway felt wrong, like it didn't belong to this building anymore. Then I saw him, not in the hallway, but inside my apartment, standing in the corner of the living room. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. He was closer now, his face still shrouded in shadow. "You're late," he whispered again, his voice somehow inside my head. Then everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the door still locked. My head ached and my body felt like it had been drained of energy. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. The man never appeared under the streetlight again, but I wasn't free. I started hearing him in my apartment, a soft whisper behind me when I was alone, a shadow moving in my peripheral vision, my reflection lingering in the mirror, a second too long. I moved out 3 weeks later, but no matter where I go, I still hear the knocking, still hear his whisper, "You're late." And deep down, I know. One day, I won't wake up. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the air is still and the world feels unnaturally silent. I had been living alone for the past 3 years in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-bedroom place with peeling wallpaper and creaky wooden floors. The building was old, the kind with history buried in its walls, but it had been home, and I never had a reason to feel unsafe. That night, I was sitting on my couch, lazily flipping through channels on the television, barely paying attention to anything. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the street lamp outside my window. The air outside was cold, and a soft drizzle had begun, the raindrops tapping lightly against the glass. It was peaceful. Then came the knock. It was a soft, deliberate knock, the kind that made my skin prickle. 3 slow, steady taps against the wooden door. I hesitated, my body tensing. It was almost 11 p.m., too late for a casual visit, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I sat there for a moment, listening. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just my neighbor from the apartment across the hall. But then, it came again. 3 knocks. Not rushed, not impatient. Just waiting. I swallowed hard and got up, moving slowly toward the door. I didn't immediately open it. Instead, I pressed my eye against the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a delivery man who had gotten the wrong apartment. But the hallway was empty. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. The dim light from the overhead fixture in the hallway flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow on the walls. I waited for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, before I finally unlocked the door and cracked it open just an inch, peering outside. No one was there. The hallway was as empty as I had seen through the peephole. The silence was deafening, the kind that made you painfully aware of your own breathing. I took a cautious step forward and looked both ways down the hall. Nothing. I exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a little foolish. Maybe some kid's playing a prank, I thought. It wouldn't be the first time. Shaking my head, I closed the door and locked it. But even as I walked back to the couch, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my bones. The rest of the night was uneventful. I distracted myself with an old movie, keeping the volume a little higher than usual to drown out the lingering silence. By the time I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion had dulled my nerves, and I convinced myself that it had been nothing. But then, it happened again. This time it was 2:37 a.m. I woke up suddenly, my heart hammering in my chest before I even knew why. My apartment was dark, the only light coming from the digital clock on my nightstand. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness. And then, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. My skin felt ice cold, a deep sense of dread washing over me. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed as quietly as possible. My bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor as I tiptoed toward the door. I didn't know why I was being so cautious, but something in my gut told me not to make a sound. I reached the door and pressed my eye against the peephole, and my blood ran cold. There was someone standing outside my apartment, a man. He was tall, with a thin, almost gaunt frame. His face was pale, his features sharp, but it was his eyes that terrified me the most. They were hollow, empty, yet somehow filled with something I couldn't quite name. He was dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing, his long coat reaching past his knees, and he wore a hat that cast a shadow over most of his face. He was staring directly at the peephole. My breath hitched in my throat and I stumbled backward, my mind racing. He couldn't possibly know I was looking. There was no way. And yet he did. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. Maybe it was sleep paralysis. Maybe I was dreaming, but when I opened them again, the knocking came once more. Knock, knock, knock. My entire body tensed. I wanted to scream, to call someone, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to move, creeping away from the door as quietly as I could. Then, just as I reached my bedroom door, my phone buzzed on my nightstand. I nearly jumped out of my skin. With trembling hands, I snatched it up, hoping, praying, it was a friend or even a wrong number. But when I saw the screen, my stomach dropped. No caller ID. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My thumb hovered over the answer button. Against every ounce of reason screaming at me, I answered. I held the phone to my ear, barely breathing. Silence. And then a whisper. Let me in. I dropped the phone. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I grabbed my phone again and fumbled to call the police. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. The moment the call connected, I heard the knock again. Only this time it was coming from inside my apartment. I spun around, every nerve in my body screaming in terror. The knocking came again, 3 steady, deliberate taps from my bedroom closet. I backed away, my legs feeling like they were about to give out. I could barely hear the voice of the emergency dispatcher on the phone. "There's someone in my apartment," I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said calmly. "Police are on their way. Can you describe the intruder?" My mouth was so dry I could barely speak. I turned my gaze toward the closet door. It was slightly ajar, the darkness within stretching out like an open mouth. The knocking had stopped, but I knew whatever was inside was still there. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't." The closet door creaked. I bolted. I ran out of the apartment so fast I barely registered the fact that I had left the door wide open. I didn't stop until I was standing outside the building, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling from head to toe. The police arrived minutes later. They searched the apartment thoroughly, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of an intruder, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But something had been. I didn't sleep in that apartment again. Within the week, I had packed up and moved out, breaking my lease without caring about the consequences. Whatever had knocked on my door that night, whoever had whispered through my phone, I didn't want to wait around to find out what would have happened if I had let them in. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining for a sound that isn't there. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I can hear it. Knock, knock, knock. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had always considered myself a practical person, someone who didn't put stock in ghost stories or paranormal events. I was more inclined to chalk up strange occurrences to overactive imaginations or the result of the mind playing tricks. But that belief was shattered one late autumn evening. It started innocuously enough. An old house on the outskirts of town, a house that had been on the market for a while and one I'd been eyeing for some time. I had just moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, looking for a fresh start after a difficult year. The house, though weathered and worn, had potential. It sat on the edge of a wooded area, its cracked windows and sagging porch giving it a certain faded charm. I was drawn to it, despite its state of disrepair. Something about it felt right. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time cleaning the house, unpacking boxes, and adjusting to the quiet rhythm of rural life. I would often take walks around the property, familiarizing myself with the land. The house was situated a good distance from the nearest neighbor, and the only sounds I could hear were the whispers of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. The locals were friendly, though they always seemed a bit distant. Conversations at the small grocery store were brief, and people tended to look at me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The older residents would often tell me stories about the town's history, some of them with a strange intensity in their voices. They spoke of old legends, of the land being cursed, of things that went bump in the night. I listened, but I didn't take them seriously. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But then something began to change. It started on the first night I stayed in the house alone. I had just finished a long day of unpacking and was looking forward to some peace and quiet. I made myself a simple dinner, sat on the couch with a book, and settled in. The night was calm, and I could hear the soft crackling of the fire I had started in the fireplace. There was nothing unusual about it at first. As the night went on, I began to feel uneasy. It was a vague sense of discomfort, something I couldn't quite place. Every now and then, I would hear a creak or groan from the old wooden beams in the house, but I dismissed it as normal settling noises. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The house was dark, with only the soft glow of the firelight spilling through the cracks in the door frame. As I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, I heard something. A faint knock. It came from the front door. 3 sharp raps, followed by silence. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone approach the house, and no one was supposed to be around at this hour. I waited for a moment, trying to shake off the strange feeling settling in my chest. I walked cautiously toward the door, unsure of what I would find on the other side. There was no one. I checked the porch through the window, empty. I opened the door to look around, but there was nothing. The street was deserted, and the trees at the edge of the property stood still, their branches barely moving in the wind. Confused, I shut the door and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I went to bed, hoping that it was just the result of too much stress. The next day, I didn't think much of it. It was a strange occurrence, but I figured it could have been someone from the town playing a prank. However, the strange events didn't stop there. Over the following days, I began to notice more oddities. Little things at first. The sound of footsteps when no one was around. The feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was in the house by myself. I would walk into a room and find things slightly out of place. A chair moved, a book shifted from its spot on the shelf. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just forgetful, maybe the house was just settling in a way that caused things to shift. But then came the night when I truly began to question my sanity. It was another late evening, and I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, reading a book. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows, and the house seemed to be alive with the sound of creaking wood and groaning floorboards. The fire in the fireplace cast long dancing shadows across the room. Suddenly there was a loud bang, as if something had struck the front door with great force. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. The house was still, but the silence was replaced with an eerie tension. I set my tea down and walked to the door, my feet heavy with dread. I opened it slowly, heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there, but this time something was different. Just beyond the door, lying on the ground, was a single white feather. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was soft, almost luminescent in the dim light. I had never seen anything like it before. It felt strange, as if it didn't belong. I looked around, scanning the yard, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no signs of life. The air was still, too still. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was lurking nearby. The next day, I went to town, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The strange occurrences seemed to stop for a while, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched. And then, about a week later, the knock came again. 3 sharp raps at the door. This time, I was prepared. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, watching the door. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I wasn't sure if I should open the door this time. The knocking had started again, but this time it felt different, darker somehow. The knocks came again, each one louder than the last. I could feel my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I grabbed the doorknob, hesitated for just a second, and opened it. Standing on the porch was a man, a stranger. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. His features were hidden in shadow, and I could only make out the faint outline of his figure in the dim light. He stood perfectly still, not moving an inch. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky, a lump rising in my throat. The man didn't speak. He just stared at me from beneath his hat, his expression unreadable. I felt a chill run through me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, like he was waiting for something. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't answer. He just stared. I took a step back, my instinct telling me to get away, to close the door. But before I could react, he spoke. His voice was low, barely audible over the wind. "Your house is not as empty as you think," he said, his words heavy with something I couldn't place. My blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, like a warning, like something from a dream. "What do you mean?" I asked, but the man didn't respond. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving me standing there, frozen. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, my mind racing with the strange encounter. Who was that man? What did he mean by those words? And why had he appeared at my door? The following days were filled with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a sign that something was wrong. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. And then, one night, I found something that I couldn't explain. I was going through some old boxes in the attic when I found a box of old photographs. Most of them were faded, worn, and yellowed with age, but there was one photo that stood out. It was a picture of the house taken years ago, long before I moved in. And in the corner of the photo, standing in the shadows by the front door, was the man. The same man who had knocked on my door. The same man who had said my house wasn't empty. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the photo, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. How could he be in this picture? How could he be here? And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I never considered myself the type to believe in ghosts. I always thought of them as stories, legends meant to spook kids or entertain people on a stormy night. That was until I met a stranger who wasn't supposed to exist. It was the winter of 2017. I had taken a job in a small town in Ohio, a quiet place where the roads stretched on for miles without another car in sight. My work required me to travel between towns, sometimes for hours at a time. I didn't mind it. The solitude gave me time to think, and the radio filled in the quiet. One night after a long shift, I was driving back home. The highway was empty except for my headlights, illuminating the endless stretch of road ahead. Snow had started falling lightly, dusting the trees on either side like something out of a postcard. It should have been peaceful. But instead, there was an unsettling stillness in the air. I first noticed him on the side of the road, a man standing just beyond the guardrail, wearing a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. I barely had time to register him before I had passed him, but something about him felt off. It wasn't just that he was standing alone in the middle of nowhere at nearly midnight. It was the way he stood, rigid, motionless, as if he had been placed there. A few miles down the road, I saw him again. My stomach dropped. Same coat, same hat, same unnerving stillness. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shallow. I knew I had driven miles past him. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, fatigue playing games with me. But then, a few miles later, I saw him again. This time, he was closer to the road. I kept driving, forcing myself not to look. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the growing sense of dread that coiled in my stomach. The further I drove, the heavier the air felt, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. Then my headlights flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. The road ahead went dark for the briefest moment before the lights came back on, and standing in the center of the road, directly in my path, was the man. I swerved violently, my tires skidding on the icy pavement. My heart hammered as I fought to regain control of the car. When I finally stopped, I was shaking, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I turned to look back. He was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking started a week later. It was always at 3 a.m., a soft, deliberate knock at my front door. 3 taps. The first time I thought it was the wind, but the second night it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I hesitated before looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I checked the locks twice before going back to bed. By the 4th night, I was on edge. The knocking had become routine, always at the exact same time. That night, instead of waiting, I sat by the door, heart pounding in my chest. At exactly 3 a.m., the knocking came. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath, hand resting on the doorknob. And then, just as I worked up the courage to open it, a whisper. "You're late." I stumbled backward, my throat tight with fear. The voice had been right outside the door, but when I looked again, nothing. I barely slept after that. I started seeing him in other places. Reflections in store windows, a shadow standing beneath the street lamp outside my apartment, always watching, always waiting. One night, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned just in time to see my bedroom mirror fogging over as if someone had exhaled against the glass. I packed a bag that night. I drove without a destination, just needing to get away. The town disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. At some point, exhaustion took over. I pulled into a motel off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs and a parking lot full of empty spaces. I checked in, ignoring the tired-looking clerk who barely glanced up from his newspaper. My room was small, with faded wallpaper and a TV that only played static. But I didn't care. I just needed sleep. I must have dozed off, but I woke up to something pressing down on my chest. My breath caught, panic surging through me. I couldn't move. The air was thick, suffocating, like something unseen was hovering just inches above me. And then the whisper came again. "You're late." I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was frozen. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the room around me seemed to darken. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the weight lifted. I gasped, sitting up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. The room was silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. But I wasn't alone. The man was standing in the corner of the room. For the first time, I saw his face. It was wrong. His skin was pale, stretched too tight over his skull. His eyes were empty, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the dim motel light. And his mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't human. I bolted from the room. I don't remember grabbing my things. I barely remember starting the car. I drove until the sun came up. I never went back to that town. I didn't tell anyone what happened because I knew they wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, I still hear it. The knocking. The whisper. "You're late." Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night was darker than usual. The kind of darkness that felt heavier, as if the world had folded in on itself. Jason never liked driving late at night, but his shift at the bar had run long, and now he was stuck on a lonely stretch of highway, miles away from home. The trees lining the road stood tall and silent, their jagged branches reaching toward the starless sky. He turned up the radio, hoping for some noise to break the eerie stillness, but only static came through. He sighed and turned it off, letting the hum of the engine be his only companion. The road was empty, not another car in sight, which was strange for this route. Usually at least a few truckers passed by, their headlights cutting through the darkness. A flicker of movement on the side of the road caught his eye. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer darting into the woods, but as he drew closer, he saw a figure standing near the guardrail. A man. Jason slowed down instinctively. The guy looked out of place, dressed in dark clothes, his face barely visible under the dim glow of the streetlights. Something about him seemed off. His posture was rigid, his head slightly tilted as he stared at Jason's approaching car. Despite the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine, Jason pulled over. Maybe the guy's car had broken down, or he needed a ride. The middle of nowhere wasn't a place anyone wanted to be stranded. Jason rolled down the window. "Hey man, you okay?" The stranger took a step forward, his face still hidden in the shadows. Jason felt his grip tighten on the steering wheel. The man's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I need a ride." Jason hesitated. Something about the way he said it, the way the words barely carried over the sound of the wind, sent a chill through him. "Where are you headed?" Jason asked cautiously. The man took another step forward, just enough for Jason to finally get a clear look at him. His skin was pale, almost too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were dark, empty, and his lips barely moved as he spoke. "Just up the road." Jason's gut told him to drive away, but he ignored it. He didn't want to be the guy who left someone stranded. "All right, hop in," he said reluctantly, unlocking the passenger door. The man slid into the seat without a word, his movements slow and deliberate. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His skin prickled as the air in the car suddenly felt colder. They drove in silence. Jason stole glances at the man. He sat unnaturally still, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't fidget, didn't look around, didn't do anything but stare straight ahead. So, what were you doing out here?" Jason asked, trying to ease the tension. The man didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was hollow. "I was waiting." "For what?" The man turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Jason's. "For you." Jason's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel. He forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "That's kinda creepy, man." The stranger didn't smile, didn't react at all. The air in the car grew even colder. Jason could see his own breath now, fogging up the windshield. Something was very, very wrong. Jason glanced at the road ahead. There was a turnoff up ahead, a small gas station he knew stayed open late. If he could just get there, he'd drop the guy off and be on his way. The man shifted in his seat. "You don't believe me." Jason swallowed hard. "Believe what?" The man tilted his head again, the motion too slow, too deliberate. "That I was waiting for you." Jason forced his eyes to stay on the road. "Look, man, I'm just giving you a ride. No need to be weird about it." The man didn't respond. They passed a faded mile marker, and Jason realized something unsettling. They should have reached the gas station by now. He knew this road well, had driven it 100 times before, but the gas station wasn't there. Just more road, more darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. "You missed your turn," the man said, his voice just above a whisper. Jason's stomach dropped. "What? You missed the turn back there." Jason shook his head. "No, that's not right. The gas station isn't there anymore." Jason's hands started to tremble. "What the hell are you talking about?" The man finally smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring one. It was a slow, eerie stretch of his lips, like he was testing the expression for the first time. Jason's pulse raced. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. Jason gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "I'm stopping the car. You need to get out." The man kept smiling. "You already let me in." Jason's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The road stretched on endlessly ahead, the trees blurring together. He pressed down on the brakes, but the car didn't slow. He hit the pedal harder. Nothing. His hands were ice cold on the wheel. The headlights barely cut through the dense fog that was suddenly rolling in, swallowing the road behind them. He turned to the man, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Jason's stomach twisted in horror. His heart slammed against his ribs as he darted his eyes around the car. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The air was deathly silent. The road stretched on and on. There were no signs, no landmarks, just endless black asphalt cutting through the void. Then the whisper came, low, right beside his ear. "You should never pick up strangers." Jason screamed. The car swerved violently. His hands jerked the wheel, tires screeching as the car spun out of control. There was a moment of weightlessness, the sickening feeling of tipping over the edge of the road. Then, impact. Darkness. When Jason woke, he was lying on the side of the road, his car wrecked in a ditch a few feet away. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, but he was alone. No sign of the stranger. No footprints, no evidence anyone else had been in the car. Just the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck slowing down, its driver stepping out. "Hey, you okay?" Jason tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The truck driver crouched beside him. "Man, you're lucky. This road's dangerous. A lot of people have accidents here." Jason swallowed, forcing his voice to work. "What happened?" The truck driver hesitated. "You must have blacked out, lost control." Jason shook his head. "No, there was a man. I picked him up. The truck driver's face darkened. "A man?" Jason nodded frantically. "Yeah, I picked him up a few miles back. He was right there." The driver's expression turned grave. He exhaled slowly. "You're not the first." Jason's heart stopped. The driver glanced at the road behind them, shaking his head. "A guy matching that description. He's been dead for years, hit by a car on this road. They say he still waits for rides. And when someone picks him up," Jason felt ice in his veins. The driver's voice was grim. "They don't always make it out." Jason shivered, glancing at the empty passenger seat of his wrecked car. It was then he noticed something, a single dark handprint on the dashboard. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was late October, and the cold autumn wind howled through the nearly deserted streets. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Claire had just left work at the small diner on the outskirts of town. Her shift had run late, as it often did, and she was eager to get home, change into warm clothes, and curl up with a book. The town of Maple Hollow was small, peaceful, and rarely did anything out of the ordinary happen. But that night, something felt different. As Claire walked down the dimly lit sidewalk, the sound of her own footsteps echoing softly, she felt an eerie sensation creeping up her spine. It was as if she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder. The street was empty, except for the occasional car passing by in the distance. Brushing off the feeling, she quickened her pace. It was only a 10-minute walk home, but the uneasy feeling refused to fade. Halfway down the block, she noticed a man standing near the corner, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. He was tall and motionless, his figure shadowed in the dim light. Claire's stomach twisted with unease. She had never seen him before. Maple Hollow wasn't the kind of town where strangers passed through unnoticed. As she walked past, the man remained silent, his head tilted slightly as though observing her. She kept her eyes forward, resisting the urge to look at him directly. Her heart pounded in her chest. A few steps later, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. There was nowhere he could have gone so quickly. The nearest alley was several feet away, and she hadn't heard footsteps running. Claire swallowed hard, shaking her head. Maybe she was just tired, her mind playing tricks on her. She kept walking. As she reached her street, she felt it again, that overwhelming sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled, and she stopped just before reaching the steps of her small rental house. She turned around slowly, her breath hitching. There he was. The man stood at the corner of the street, the very place she had last seen him. He hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. Claire's hands trembled as she fumbled for her keys, her pulse hammering in her ears. She rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Taking a deep breath, she pressed her forehead against the door. She would call the police. Reaching for her phone, she hesitated. What would she say? That a man was just standing there? That he had vanished and reappeared? They would think she was imagining things. Claire peeked through the peephole. The street was empty. She exhaled, forcing a nervous laugh. Maybe she was just paranoid. She had read too many horror stories, watched too many true crime documentaries. That night, sleep did not come easy. She woke around 3 a.m., the room unusually cold. A chill crawled up her spine as she realized she hadn't left any windows open. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Claire's breath hitched in her throat. She lived alone. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but before she could grasp it, she heard a whisper, a single word, barely audible. Claire. Her blood ran cold. She bolted upright in bed, heart racing, her breath coming in quick gasps. The room was still, but she felt it, an oppressive presence lingering in the air. She wasn't alone. Summoning every ounce of courage, she reached for the bedside lamp and switched it on. The warm glow filled the room, but it did nothing to ease the fear constricting her chest. Silence. Had she imagined it? She sat frozen for several moments before slowly getting up. Her legs felt unsteady as she tiptoed toward the hallway. Nothing. The house was empty. She returned to bed, but barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, Claire decided to put it behind her. Maybe she had been dreaming. She went about her day as usual, pushing the memory aside. That evening, as she walked home from work, the uneasy sensation returned. She glanced around, her stomach twisting. There he was, standing at the same corner. She picked up her pace, refusing to look at him. When she reached her house, she locked the door behind her and pressed her back against it, her heart hammering. Enough was enough. She grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Lisa. "I think I'm being followed," Claire whispered. Lisa arrived 20 minutes later, her expression concerned. "Tell me everything." Claire recounted the last 2 nights, her voice shaking. Lisa's brow furrowed. "Are you sure he's even real?" she asked hesitantly. "What do you mean?" Lisa hesitated. "I mean, maybe you're seeing something that isn't there. A ghost." Claire's stomach twisted. She had always been skeptical of the supernatural, but deep down she knew this wasn't just an ordinary stalker. "Stay at my place tonight," Lisa offered. Relieved, Claire grabbed her things and they left together. That night, she felt safe for the first time in days. Until she woke up. The room was freezing, the air heavy. Then the whisper came again. "Claire." She shot up in bed, heart pounding. Lisa was sound asleep beside her. Claire forced herself to breathe, gripping the blanket tightly. Then something moved in the corner of the room. A shadow. Tall. Motionless. Watching. Claire's throat tightened. The shadow figure stood there for what felt like hours. Then slowly it stepped backward, into the wall, until it was gone. Claire gasped for breath, unable to move. Had Lisa seen it too? She shook her friend awake. Lisa blinked groggily. "What's wrong?" Claire pointed to the now empty corner. There was someone here. Lisa rubbed her eyes. "You're just having nightmares." Claire wanted to believe that, but deep down she knew. The stranger had followed her, and he wasn't going to leave. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. She stayed at Lisa's, but every night she heard the whisper. Then, one evening as they walked together to Lisa's car, Lisa suddenly stopped, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Claire asked. Lisa pointed across the street. Claire turned. There he was. Lisa had finally seen him. A chill ran through Claire. "You see him?" Lisa nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible." "What?" Claire's stomach dropped. Lisa swallowed hard. "Claire, that's my uncle." Claire's blood ran cold. Lisa's voice trembled. "He died 10 years ago." Claire's breath came in short gasps as she turned back to the man. He was gone. Tears stung her eyes. "Why is he following me?" Lisa's hands shook. "I don't know, but we need to find out." That night, they did their research. Lisa's uncle, Daniel, had lived in Maple Hollow. He had been in an accident at the very intersection where Claire first saw him. He had died instantly. But there was something else. Daniel had a daughter who had been taken from him years before. A daughter named Claire. Claire's hands trembled as she read the old article. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "Claire, I think he's looking for you." The realization hit her like a wave. The stranger wasn't a threat. He was her father. Tears streamed down her face. The fear, the whispers, the presence. It all made sense. That night, Claire did something she never thought she would. She spoke. "Dad," she whispered into the darkness. "You found me." The air grew still. Then, for the first time, the whisper wasn't eerie. It was warm. Claire. And just like that, the presence faded. She never saw him again. But she never felt alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was a cold, rainy night when Alex found himself stranded on the side of a desolate road. His car had sputtered and died without warning, leaving him alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. The darkness pressed in around him, the only sound the patter of rain on the windshield and the distant rumble of thunder. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. He sighed, rubbing his temples. The last gas station he had passed was at least 10 miles back, and walking in this weather didn't seem like the best idea. He had no choice but to wait and hope for another car to pass by. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the rain intensified, turning the road into a slick, glistening ribbon of black. Just as he was about to give up hope, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching slowly. Relief washed over him as the vehicle, a beat-up old pickup, rolled to a stop beside him. The driver leaned out of the window, an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice deep and rough. "Yeah," Alex nodded. "It just died on me. No signal out here either." The man nodded, his gaze lingering on Alex for a moment too long. "Hop in. I can take you to the nearest town. Got a mechanic there." Something about the man unsettled Alex, but he didn't have much of a choice. The rain was coming down hard, and staying out here all night wasn't an option. He grabbed his bag, locked the car, and climbed into the truck. The inside smelled of damp earth and old leather, and a faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air. The man didn't speak much as they drove, and the silence between them grew heavy. Alex tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him, chalking it up to exhaustion and the strangeness of the situation. But as they drove deeper into the night, he began to notice something odd. The road seemed unfamiliar despite having checked his GPS earlier. There had been only one main highway leading to town, but the man had turned onto a smaller, winding road, one that snaked through the dense forest. Trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows in the truck's dim headlights. Are we still headed toward town?" Alex finally asked. The man didn't answer right away. Then, in a slow, measured voice, he said, "Shortcut." Something about the way he said it made Alex's stomach tighten. The unease gnawed at him, growing with each passing mile. He glanced at the truck's dashboard, noticing the fuel gauge was nearly empty. "You low on gas?" Alex asked, hoping to steer the conversation in a safer direction. The man didn't respond. He just kept driving, his grip on the steering wheel tight. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but the night seemed even darker than before. Alex's pulse quickened. He needed to get out of this truck. Up ahead, the road split into two paths. One led into what looked like a long, empty stretch of road, while the other disappeared into the forest. Without hesitation, the man veered toward the trees. That was it. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps. "I think I'd rather wait for another car to pass by," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man finally turned to him, and Alex's blood ran cold. His face seemed different now, his features stretched, his eyes darker. The dim light of the dashboard cast shadows over his skin, making it look sickly and pale. "You already got in," the man murmured. "No turning back now." Panic surged through Alex. He fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was down, stuck in place. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Let me out," he demanded. The man said nothing. He just kept driving, his expression void of emotion. Alex did the only thing he could think of. He reached for his bag and pulled out his flashlight. In one swift motion, he swung it at the man's face. The truck swerved violently as the man let out a guttural snarl, more animal than human. Alex seized the opportunity, yanking at the door handle with all his strength. The truck hit a pothole, jerking violently. The lock popped open just as Alex threw himself out of the moving vehicle, hitting the wet ground with a painful thud. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his side, and ran into the woods. Behind him, the truck screeched to a halt. A door slammed. Alex didn't look back. He sprinted through the trees, branches tearing at his clothes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain had all but stopped, and leaving only the eerie sound of dripping water and the occasional snap of twigs beneath his feet. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Unrelenting. The man was following him. Alex pushed himself harder, dodging trees, slipping on wet leaves. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Then, up ahead, he saw something. A cabin. Small and worn down, it sat in a clearing, its single window dark. Hope surged through him. Maybe he could hide inside. He reached the door and shoved it open, stumbling inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, but he had no time to think about that. He shut the door and locked it, pressing his back against it as he tried to steady his breathing. Outside, the footsteps slowed. They stopped. Silence. Then a soft knock. Alex bit back a cry. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his entire body trembling. The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have run." Alex's blood turned to ice. The door handle rattled, but the lock held. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading into the night. He stayed there for what felt like hours, frozen in place, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no truck, just the distant hoot of an owl. Slowly, cautiously, he moved away from the door. He needed to find a way out of here. His hands fumbled in the darkness while searching for something, anything, he could use as a weapon. That's when he saw it, a photograph on the wall. His breath caught in his throat. It was a faded, yellowed picture of the man from the truck. But the photograph was old, decades old. And beneath it, in smeared handwriting, were the words, "Do not let him take you." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The man wasn't just some stranger. He was something else. Something that had been doing this for a very long time. Alex's head snapped toward the window. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed and terrified. Then, in the darkness behind him, another face appeared. A face with hollow, soulless eyes. The end.
Story number 8.
The night air was thick with humidity as Mark drove down the winding country road, the scent of wet earth and pine trees filling his car. The sky overhead was moonless, the darkness only broken by the twin beams of his headlights cutting through the dense fog. His shift at the hospital had run longer than expected, leaving him on this isolated road close to midnight. He hated this route. It was too quiet, too lonely, and had too many stories surrounding it. Locals talked about strange happenings on this stretch of road. Stories of people seeing figures on the side of the highway, of drivers picking up passengers who disappeared before they reached their destination. Mark wasn't the superstitious type, but the stories had always stuck with him. Still, he told himself that exhaustion was making him paranoid. The road twisted through miles of thick forest. He hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes. The only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the steady hum of his tires against the pavement. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. His hands instinctively tightened on the wheel. A hitchhiker? Out here? There were no towns nearby, no houses he could recall. The nearest gas station was a good 10 miles back. He slowed the car as he got closer, his headlights illuminating the figure. A woman. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her long, dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. She wasn't dressed for the chilly night, just a thin white dress that barely reached her knees. Her bare feet were caked with mud, and her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so. Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep driving. But something about her seemed off. She didn't flag him down. She wasn't waving for help. She just stood there, staring at the road ahead. He pulled up beside her and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman turned her head slowly to face him. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and expressionless. For a moment, she just stared at him. Mark felt an icy chill creep up his spine. "Can I get a ride?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about her tone made the hair on his arm stand up. He hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Yeah, sure. Where are you headed?" She climbed into the car without answering. Her movements were slow and deliberate. As soon as she was inside, the temperature in the car dropped. Mark shivered, but told himself it was just his imagination. He pulled back onto the road. "So, where are you going?" he asked again, trying to sound casual. "Home," she murmured. Mark nodded, waiting for her to give an address, but she didn't. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. Where exactly is home?" he pressed. She turned her head slightly, looking at him from the corner of her eye. "Just keep driving." A chill ran through him. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe something had happened to her, but something in her voice made his stomach twist with unease. "Okay," he said slowly. The road stretched ahead, seemingly endless. The fog thickened, clinging to the trees like ghostly tendrils. The farther they drove, the quieter it became. Even the usual chirping of insects had disappeared. Mark glanced at his passenger again. She hadn't moved, hadn't shifted in her seat. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her fingers were unnaturally thin, the skin stretched tightly over her knuckles. Something was wrong. "So, do you live around here?" he asked, trying to break the silence. She didn't answer at first. Then, in that same whisper-like tone, she said, "I used to." A shiver crawled up his spine. "Used to?" She didn't elaborate. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He kept glancing at the GPS on his dashboard, but it wasn't responding. The screen flickered, the route frozen. He tapped it a few times, but nothing changed. His gut clenched. "How long until we get to your house?" he asked. She turned her head fully toward him now. A slow, almost unnatural motion. "Not long." Mark nodded, forcing himself to focus on the road. The fog was getting thicker, swirling in unnatural patterns around the car. His high beams barely cut through it. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Her reflection in the passenger side window was wrong. She was facing him, but her reflection was still looking straight ahead. His pulse spiked. His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He told himself he was imagining it, that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But then she spoke again. "You're not listening," she said softly. Mark's breath hitched. "What?" Her voice was lower now, almost a hiss. "You should never pick up strangers." Mark's grip on the wheel tightened. "What are you talking about?" She smiled. It was slow, unnatural, stretching her lips too wide. "You shouldn't have stopped." Mark's stomach turned. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. There was something in the back seat, a dark shape, shifting, moving. His breath came in short gasps. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't seen anyone else get in. Who else is in the car?" he stammered. The woman didn't answer. She just kept smiling. Mark's hands were slick with sweat as he pressed down on the gas pedal. The speedometer climbed, but the road still stretched on endlessly. The GPS remained frozen, the screen flickering with static. Then the whisper came. Not from the woman, from behind him. "You let us in." Mark's heart nearly stopped. His vision blurred with panic as he gripped the wheel. The road ahead was disappearing into the thick fog. He couldn't see. He couldn't think. Something cold touched the back of his neck. He screamed. The car swerved violently. Tires screeched. The world spun in a blur of darkness and fog. Then, silence. Mark woke up slumped over the steering wheel, his head pounding. The windshield was cracked. His car had veered off the road and into a shallow ditch. The passenger seat was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around, his pulse hammering. The door beside him was still locked. The seatbelt was still fastened. But the car was ice cold. Slowly, trembling, he reached for his phone. The screen was shattered. but it still worked. The time read 3:07 a.m. Had he blacked out? Imagined everything? He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Then something caught his eye. On the fogged-up passenger window, a single word was written. Thanks. Mark's stomach dropped. Shaking, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Without looking back, without questioning, he pulled onto the road and sped away. He didn't stop, didn't look in the rearview mirror, and he never picked up another stranger again. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The night I met the stranger began like any other. I had just finished a long shift at the local diner and was on my way home, eager to take off my uniform and collapse into bed. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. It was just after midnight, and the city seemed quieter than usual, almost too quiet. The air had a strange, thick feeling to it, as though something was hanging in the atmosphere, waiting. I turned down the narrow road that led to my apartment complex. The streetlights cast weak pools of light on the cracked pavement, and the wind rustled the leaves in the trees, making them sound like whispers. My car's engine hummed steadily as I passed the old abandoned store on the corner. It had been closed for as long as I could remember, and every time I drove by, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The place was dark, its windows boarded up, but something about it always made me uneasy. It felt as if the building itself was watching me, waiting. That night was no different. As I drove past, I glanced at the store, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The streets were deserted, and I had a long drive ahead before I could get home and forget the unease I felt. I turned onto the main road, the one that led to my apartment, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, just before the intersection. A tall man dressed in a dark coat and a fedora that obscured most of his face. His posture was rigid, almost too perfect, as if he were waiting for something or someone. I slowed my car as I neared him, a strange pull in my chest urging me to stop. But I kept driving, my mind telling me to ignore him. After all, it was the middle of the night, and people sometimes lingered in odd places. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. His head turned as I passed, slowly, almost unnaturally slow, as if he was following the motion of my car. I couldn't see his eyes. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his fedora, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and intense. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself instinctively gripping the steering wheel tighter. I turned a corner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the street, but there was nothing. The road was empty, as if he had never been there. I breathed a little easier, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I arrived at my apartment building a few minutes later, parked my car, and made my way inside. The building was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the elevator. I pressed the button to my floor, and as the doors slid shut, I couldn't help but glance at the small mirror inside. My reflection was there, but for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me. I spun around, but the elevator was empty. I told myself I was tired, that I needed rest. I had just worked a long shift, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered, like a cold weight on my chest. When I reached my apartment, I quickly locked the door behind me and went to the bathroom to wash off the lingering feeling of dread. I stood in front of the mirror, splashing my face with cold water, trying to shake off the sense of being watched. My eyes moved to the window, and I froze. The blinds were slightly ajar, and I could see a figure standing across the street. A tall man, dressed in a dark coat and fedora. I turned away from the window quickly, my heart racing. There was no way it was the same person. Was it? My mind spun, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was just some stranger out for a late-night walk. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, and I couldn't ignore the growing dread in my chest. I stayed up for hours, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made me jump. It felt as if the very walls were closing in on me, as if something or someone was waiting just beyond my sight. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock at my door. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it was there. Knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. I couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked at my door this late. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The knocking continued, more insistent now. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door as if I could somehow make it go away with my mind. I thought about calling the police, but something told me that wouldn't help. I had no idea who would be at my door, and I wasn't about to open it. Knock, knock, knock. I slowly backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get away from it. I didn't want to be here anymore, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the weight of the fear was holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot. And then, through the silence, I heard a voice. A soft, gravelly voice, muffled by the door. "I know you're in there." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I strained to hear it again, but the words were lost in the muffled sound of the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it someone I knew? A prank? No, this didn't feel like a joke. The voice spoke again, louder this time. "You can't hide forever." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to my phone, and my hands were shaking as I typed out a quick text to my best friend, Sarah. "Hey, are you awake? Someone's at my door." I pressed send and waited, glancing nervously back at the door. The knocking had stopped, but the voice remained. It seemed to linger in the air, pressing down on me like a physical weight. A minute passed, then 2. Sarah's reply came through, and I read the message with a sense of urgency. "Call the cops. Don't open the door. I'm on my way." I didn't waste another second. My hand shook as I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but something in the back of my mind told me that the stranger was still out there, waiting. I stayed by the door, watching the peephole, listening for any sign of movement. The silence felt deafening, like the calm before a storm. Every sound, every slight rustle, made my heart race. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no knocks, no voice. I waited for what felt like hours, my mind playing tricks on me. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. It wasn't until the sound of sirens in the distance that I finally felt some relief. The police arrived shortly after, and I opened the door, too relieved to care who was standing outside. I let them in, my voice still shaky as I explained what had happened. They did a quick sweep of the building, but found nothing. No sign of the stranger, no trace of anyone having been near my door. It didn't make sense. I had heard the voice, felt the presence, but there was no one there. The officers checked the building and assured me that they would keep an eye out, but they had no explanation for what I had experienced. The next day, I didn't leave my apartment. I stayed inside, too afraid to go out to see if the stranger would return. But as the days passed, I began to tell myself it had been a one-time thing, a bad night, an overactive imagination. That was until I drove down the same street again a week later. As I passed the old abandoned store, I saw him, the stranger, standing in the exact same spot. And this time his gaze didn't turn with my car. It stayed fixed on me, unblinking. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept driving, the feeling of his eyes burning into the back of my neck. I didn't know what he wanted. But I knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done with me yet. Story the end.